done this, they've spent a lot of taxpayers' money, and the answer is, so far as we can tell, the human effect is at the level of the noise in the natural climate system. So, why then do we still have all this discussion in the press? Why are we still surrounded by politicians and businessmen that want to impose carbon taxes on us? Why aren't they listening to this? And the answer is what I call the carbonista sandwich. And I really do need a slide here to show you, which I don't have. The slide has about 10 lines of text on it, and the top line and the bottom line are both in a different colour. That's the bread of the sandwich. And in between are 8 lines, all in the same colour. Now I'll tell you what the top line is. The top line is what I've just told you. It's the Greens and the NGOs raising this question in 1988. And I'll tell you what the bottom line is. It's the media who relentlessly broadcast bad news messages. They will not broadcast a good news message, and they want, because it doesn't sell their paper and their advertising. And they want everything reduced to a simple he says, she says, headbutting argument between two imaginary groups that are angels and devils, thinking of the other talk tonight, but to you are known as the climate skeptics, which is me, big bad boy, or climate denier, and the angels of the IPCC and CSIRO. Okay. So you have this simplification by the press and the constant repetition of alarmist information about climate. Now that's the 2 pieces of bread. The 8 lines in between include the politicians, and these are the major groups in our society who benefit from climate alarmism. What benefit do the politicians get? They get your vote. That's their prime reason for being, is to get your vote. And the reason they have a climate policy, and they do it the way they do, is to attract swinging votes in marginal seats so they can get into government. And one shouldn't be critical of them. They're politicians, it's their job to do that. But it doesn't mean that you should believe what they're telling you. So the lines in between, I won't remember all of them, but one line is the politicians, the next line is big government bureaucracies like the Australian Greenhouse Office, that is now the Department of Climate Change. Penny Wong's department's got an annual budget of $200 million. What's the most sacred duty of the secretary of a government department? Doesn't matter what the department is, what's the most sacred duty of that secretary?
To stay employed.
To stay employed. To make sure next year's budget is at least as big as last year's budget, and preferably better. And I'm not parodying the situation, that's reality. You don't have to watch Humphrey to understand that. So you've got big bureaucracies, and the biggest of the lot is the IPCC, which has an enormous self-interest in perpetuating the funding that it gets. You have business groups. You want a windmill minister? Well, it doesn't compete with coal-fired power station, doesn't come close to it. Oh, you'll give me a 30% subsidy? No, well, I'll build you a windmill. I've got several windmills for you tomorrow, Minister. Thank you. Do you want a solar farm? Can't build that. Oh, you'll give me a subsidy for that too. There are enormous commercial interests now in all the alternative energy games, and the biggest self-interest of the lot, and what should really alarm you, is that the 2 biggest commercial lobbyists for carbon trading were Enron, remember them?
Yeah.
They're the American energy company that was bankrupted by their own dishonesty, and Lehman Brothers. One of the world's biggest sets of financiers who also became insolvent recently. And it is the financial markets and the financial interests that are now the most dangerous influence and the strongest lobbyists for carbon trading. Because carbon trading is unique in history. It's supposed to be a commodity market. Well, a commodity market is wheat, coal, iron ore. You pay your money, the check goes in the bank, and you've got a truck full of whatever it is. Carbon trading, carbon dioxide is a colourless, visibleless, odourless gas, which is difficult to measure accurately, so they don't measure it, they computer model the amount you're producing, and nothing changes hands when you trade it except a piece of paper. And every time the piece of paper goes past, Macquarie Bank says, thank you very much. It's a ticket clipper's dream, carbon trading. And it is, they are also the biggest group in society now lobbying for this. I'm going to go back one thought. When I was talking to you about computer modelling, And I told you about the report that was done for Mr. Carr for New South Wales. We had a similar report done in Queensland, and I omitted to read you at the time the statement that CSIRO puts inside the cover of all these reports. This is the statement. Important disclaimer. This report relates to climate change scenarios based on computer modelling. Right? Models involve simplifications of the real processes that are not fully understood. Oh, that's interesting, isn't it? Accordingly, no responsibility will be accepted by CSIRO or the Queensland Government for the accuracy of forecasts or predictions inferred from this report, or for any person's interpretations, deductions, conclusions, or actions in reliance on this report. Would you buy a used car from these people? I'm going to say one other thing about the socio-political pathology. I don't have time for a moment to talk about all the 8 groups. I've mentioned some of them briefly. But there's one I just want to take a little slightly longer time to deal with, and that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I mentioned it had 4 reports. I'm going to now read you the key sentence out of each of those 4 reports. In 1990, the IPCC said, the observed 20th century temperature increase could be due largely to natural variability. That statement remains true today. It was true in 1990 and is true today. However, in 1995 the IPCC said the balance of the evidence suggests a discernible human influence on climate. In 2001 they said there is new and stronger evidence that most of the warming observed in the last 50 years is attributable to human activities. And in 2007 they said most of the observed increase in globally average temperature since the mid-20th century is very likely due to the observed increase in anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentrations. Now, a couple of comments about that. The first is, there's no statement there that we have measured the human greenhouse effect and it's X. For the very good reason they haven't and they can't. So instead of a scientific statement, you're getting basically a piece of socio-political advice in all these things. Second thing is, as those years elapsed, 20 years elapsed, independent scientists outside the IPCC were publishing papers in the refereed literature which actually were making the case for dangerous human warming weaker and weaker and weaker. And as that's happening in the scientific literature, the IPCC is producing these stronger and stronger and stronger statements. Now the last one this year is made in such a way that nobody, and especially not our government, should ever pay any attention to what the IPCC says again. I'll read it again. Most of the observed increase in globally average temperature since the mid-20th century is very likely due to the observed increase in anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentrations. What do they mean by very likely? Well, I'll tell you what they mean, because they have a table that tells you. Very likely, greater than 90% probability. And that was in our newspapers at the time when they reported on this. Greater than 90% probability is a statement which, in a scientific context, has a definite meaning. It means you have done multiple trials on something, and you know that 9 times out of 10, and there is demonstrable mathematical evidence for that statement. There is no mathematical basis for this statement whatsoever. It's the considered opinion, and it might be a good opinion, but then again it might not. The key point is, it's a considered opinion of a group of experts sitting around a table thrashing out the wording. It is simply not good enough for our government to accept policy advice from people who masquerade, deliberately masquerade. This has been termed fraudulent, and in a scientific sense, and it probably is fraudulent in a scientific sense. So, that's the problem with the IPCC. It may belong to the United Nations, and that might be viewed by many as a good thing, but the reality is they have form, and that form does not lead us to place a great deal of trust in them.